Thank you for joining us here at the Jamestown Foundation for our panel on women's rights in Central Asia. This has been organized with the Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center. And so thank you very much, Dr. Cohen, for your support and participation in this. As we know, Kazakhstan recently adopted legislation to better protect women and children from domestic violence. The package, commonly known as the Saltanat laws, was named after a young woman brutally killed by her husband and a former government minister. His trial was widely publicized and live streamed for the first time in history of the courts. Saltanat's murder sparked unprecedented mobilization of women's rights groups, invigorated civil society, and re-energized the modernization and reform programs initiated under President Tokayev. For a bit of background on this, I strongly recommend our Eurasia Daily Monitor deputy editor's article that came out on Tuesday by Mamie Powers. It's available on the website, and I think it will be up on Substack today. Changing legislation to protect women and children from domestic violence has been on the agenda of governments and civil society in the region for several years. Reforms are also ongoing, and some of them to boost women's social and political standing and changing public attitudes, particularly among men, on the right of every woman to be treated as an equal member of society. By comparison, domestic violence in Russia was decriminalized in 2017 and is currently underreported. For our two organizations, women's rights are both a human rights concern and a matter of security and development. And I'm hard-pressed to think of any major social change that I'm aware of, and generally for the better, that did not enjoy and earn the support of women in society. Women's plight in Afghanistan and Iran is a telling example of how suppressing women and denying them equal economic and social position can endanger security and hamper economic progress. Recent convictions of women's rights activists in China are also a stark contrast to the ongoing reforms in Central Asia. So we've invited today distinguished experts on gender equality to share their insights about current developments in Central Asia pertaining to the elimination of violence against women, as well as increasing their economic participation and political representation of women at all levels of society and government in the 5 central states. And very pleased today that in addition to Dr. Cohen, we have Dr. Jennifer Wistron, the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, Joy Neumeyer, a journalist and historian of Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia, Dr. Ariel Cohen of the International Tax Investment Center, Dina Danilova, coordinator of the Academy of Women Entrepreneurs in Kazakhstan and a business partner of JSC NC Kazmunagas, and of course, Ambassador Medina Jarbasnyova, the UN Commission on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I'll turn it over to Senior Fellow at Jamestown, Margarita Asanova. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for the patience today. We are having a really distinguished panel today with so many experts and specialists on the topic who know a lot more than we as analysts could ever know, because this is what they deal with on a daily basis. I would like to start with Dr. Jennifer Wistron, who is Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, to talk about not only domestic violence. The purpose of this panel today is to talk about domestic violence, which is a problem in Central Asia, but it's also a problem in many other European countries. Germany, for example, recently announced 7% increase of domestic violence cases in the country, with an increased number of women killed by their domestic partners. But we're also going to talk about women's realization in society, their social standing, their economic rights, their realization as equal members of the society, as engine of change, and which is extremely important. But it all starts from the family. If a woman is well respected in her family, that means society respects women, and that elevates their status within the society and subsequently in politics. And I'm turning to Dr. Wistron today first, and then I will turn to Ambassador Jarbusinova, who is going to talk about the United Nations programs in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. And I want to thank everyone very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion. As Margarita mentioned, discussions about women's rights in Central Asia are very needed. But before I focus specifically on women's rights in Central Asia, I'd like to emphasize that, unfortunately, discussions about women's rights everywhere are very needed. Gender-based violence, which is going to underscore today's discussion, is the umbrella term that is used to describe any harmful act that is perpetrated against a person's will, that is based on a person's sex or gender or orientation, whether actual or presumed. Gender-based violence can assume many different forms. Two examples are sexual violence and sex-selective abortions. Sexual violence and sex-selective abortions manifest in former Soviet Central Asia. They manifest across the greater former Soviet space, and they manifest throughout the world. Examples of sexual violence include, but are not limited to, rape, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, and trafficking. Sexual violence can also include coerced sexual acts in exchange for food, shelter, protection, and resources. This kind of sexual violence tends to predominate in conflict zones. The Central American countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have extremely high rates of sexual violence, including femicide, which is the targeted killing of women or those who identify as female. A woman is killed nearly every day in Honduras. At the same time, incidences of sexual violence have skyrocketed in Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion of Russia in 2020. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. Sex-selective abortion is the voluntary termination of a pregnancy based on the anticipated sex of a child, generally a girl. Sex-selective abortions are most often associated with China and its one-child policy. However, sex-selective abortions are also very common in the South Caucasus. And as of 2023, Azerbaijan leads the world in the number of sex-selective abortions. I wanted to open with this introduction not to diminish the importance of the discussion about women's rights in Central Asia, which is obviously the focus of today's discussion, but rather to underscore, as Margarita mentioned in her introduction, that Central Asia is not alone in its quest to combat gender-based violence and other abuses against girls and women. The global community is complicit in this violence and these abuses. So what is Saltanat's law? Dr. Cohen mentioned it briefly. Margarita mentioned it briefly. Saltanat's law is a Kazakhstani law named after the late Saltanat Nukanova. Saltanat was the wife of Kundik Bishimbayev, a businessman and former minister of the economy of Kazakhstan. In November of last year, Saltanat was brutally beaten by her husband in a restaurant in Almaty. By the time an ambulance was called and had arrived, Saltanat had already been deceased for a number of hours. According to the postmortem examination, Saltanat had sustained brain injuries and a number of other serious bodily harms. Last month, a court in Astana sentenced Bishimbayev to 24 years in prison for the murder of his wife. This month, Saltanat's laws take effect. In brief, and we will obviously talk about this at greater length, but Saltanat's laws reverses 2017 legislation that decriminalized domestic violence. So that leads one to discuss what is the status of domestic violence in Central Asia. While Saltanat's law is significant, it's important to note that there are many forms of gender-based violence that are not impacted by the law. For example, rape is only viewed through the lens of assault, not through the lens of lack of consent. At the same time, domestic violence is widespread in Kazakhstan and elsewhere in Central Asia, and unfortunately, it's unlikely to be eliminated through the passage of one law or set of laws. According to data published in The Diplomat in December of last year, 1/3 of Tajikistani women are estimated to be victims of domestic violence. Between 2022 and 2023, cases of domestic violence in the Kyrgyz Republic increased 20%, while between 2018 and 2023, complaints of domestic violence in Kazakhstan tripled, reaching 100,000 cases in 2023. Additionally, according to UNDP's Gender Social Norms Index, which surveys and quantifies men's and women's bias against women, there's a comparatively high degree of bias against women in Central Asia. In Kazakhstan, Only 8.74% of women are estimated to not face any gender bias. In the Kyrgyz Republic, the figure is 2.6%, while in Tajikistan, the figure is 2.32%. These numbers are significant because bias against women generally translates into tolerance for domestic violence. If the Central Asian states want to begin to stem the tide of domestic violence, they need, unquestionably, to pass more laws like Saltanat's law, including laws that are more comprehensive in nature. And by that, I mean, going back to where I said rape is only viewed through one lens, not multiple lenses. They also need to sign, or I should say, they also need to aspire to sign and ratify international accords, such as the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, also known as the Istanbul Convention. Additionally, the Central Asian states need to continue to increase women's representation in local, regional, and national government. According to UN Women, in Kazakhstan, 27% of parliamentarians are women and 11% of ministers are women. In the Kyrgyz Republic, 20% of parliamentarians are women and 13% of ministers are women. While in Tajikistan, 27% of parliamentarians are women and 14% of ministers are women. So to underscore, again, laws are critically important. There needs to be more of them, and they need to be more comprehensive in nature. Unfortunately, governments and laws alone will not succeed in stemming the tide of domestic violence in Central Asia, as long as bias against women in Central Asia exists to the degree that it does. While bias against women in Central Asia has always existed, just as I would underscore, it's always existed everywhere, it experienced a resurgence in Central Asia following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, especially in the region's more rural and less educated areas. On the one hand, this bias took the form of certain ideas about gender roles and relations. From the national government to the local village, women's roles, first and foremost as wives and mothers, reassumed heightened importance. Married women had higher status and held more power than unmarried girls. Married women with children had higher status and held more power than unmarried women without children. Women who had sons had higher status and held more power than women who only had daughters. Unmarried girls, meaning those who were past the marriage age, had low status and held little power in the family. And the youngest, newest daughter-in-law in a family had the lowest status and held the least amount of power until either another younger or newer daughter-in-law arrived, or she started to have children, especially sons. At the same time that women's roles, first and foremost as wives and mothers, were reassuming heightened importance, so too were ideas about women and work outside the home. According to a World Bank study, quote, globally, women earn about 80% of what men earn on average, but the gap is larger in Central Asia. Working women earn about 60% of what men earn in Tajikistan, 61% in Uzbekistan, 75% in the Kyrgyz Republic, and 78% in Kazakhstan. The study goes on to say, if women across Central Asia were to participate in equal measure to men, national income would be anywhere from 27% higher in Kazakhstan 63% higher in Tajikistan. The World Bank study goes on to cite, quote, restrictive gender norms and the way these norms translate into discrimination as impediments to Central Asian women's participation in the labor market. I agree with the World Bank study's conclusions. At the same time, I think that the kind of economy that has developed in parts of Central Asia in the post-Soviet period has served to reinforce these, quote, restrictive gender norms and the way these norms translate into discrimination. Specifically, following the collapse of the Soviet economy, which was a command economy, labor migration between Central Asia and Russia, which existed during the Soviet period, assumed heightened importance, especially in Tajikistan, and it continues to play a critical role in Tajikistan's, the Kyrgyz Republic's, and Uzbekistan's economies today. According to the World Bank, in 2023, the top 5 remittance-receiving countries as a percentage of GDP were number 1, Tajikistan, at 48.2%, number 2, Tonga at 40.6%, number 3, Samoa at 32%, number 4, Lebanon at 27.5%, And number 5, Nicaragua at 26.9%. Tajikistan's GDP is more dependent on remittances than any other country in the world. 2 other Central Asian states' GDPs are also, however, highly dependent on remittances. 20.5% of the Kyrgyz Republic's GDP is dependent on remittances, while for Uzbekistan, the figure is 17.8%. Labor migration is generally predicated on one member of the family being away for several, if not many, months of the year. In Central Asia, it's generally the father or another breadwinning male who migrates, leaving the family's girls and women to assume the roles the missing males would normally fill. This arrangement renders it very difficult for many girls and women to complete their educations, let alone work outside the home, because they are consumed with filling their and their male counterparts' household duties. And before I conclude, just to illustrate this point, I want to share a quote from research I did earlier among girls and women, not in rural Central Asia, but in rural Azerbaijan, circling back to the point that this is a problem not just in Central Asia, but elsewhere. And this quote comes from a family in rural Azerbaijan where a lot, I would say a lot, if not most, of the husbands, fathers, brothers, and uncles engaged in labor migration. And as a consequence, this shifted gender roles and relations, resulting in conflict, resulting in strife in the family, and also resulting in decreased opportunities for girls to pursue education, to delay marriage, to have income-generating opportunities outside the home. So this quote that has stuck with me for years is that in this family, there was a mother and father, 2 girls who were of college age, and a son who had just graduated high school. The father was in Moscow working. He was a labor migrant. He was gone probably about 8 months of the year. The son was doing his mandatory military service. And so this left the mother and the 2 daughters to run the household, to work the farm. And the farm was what produced the produce that was then sold in Moscow. And both of these girls had actually been accepted to university in Baku. But because of the arrangement, they were only able to spend a couple of months each year. So it was one day, it was an extremely hot, tiring, stressful day. And I should mention also, not only had both of these young women been accepted to university, they were trying to go part-time, but they also had jobs outside of the home. One was working as a school teacher part-time, and one was working as a bookkeeper. And so on this particular day, all 3 of these women, the mother, the 2 daughters, come home, and the older daughter gets frustrated with her mother, who tells her that she's supposed to prepare dinner. And she looks at her mother and says, "I don't understand, aren't you the wife?" Implying that in her role in the family, she should be the one making dinner for the family. And the daughter responds, and I'm sorry, flip that around. And then the mother responds, "No, I'm not the wife, I'm the husband, who milks the cows, takes them to pasture, feeds the chicken, cuts the weeds, looks after the fruits and vegetables." So you see, basically here you have gender roles are critically important because of labor migration. It's forcing a shift in roles, which is differentially impacting women. And because of the fact in Central Asia, specifically Tajikistan, you have a disproportionate reliance on this economic system. It is disproportionately impacting women's abilities to get a leg up. And this is where domestic violence comes back in. So in sum, I want to conclude domestic violence is a very serious problem in Central Asia that derives, at least in part, from cultural or societal beliefs about and expectations for gender roles and relations, beliefs and expectations that limit girls' and women's abilities to work outside the home, especially in areas that are highly dependent on labor migration for their economic well-being. Laws like Saltanat's laws can take some serious steps with respect to addressing domestic violence, but the interplay between culture, society, and economy is equally important and less easily amended by way of laws.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer. This was such a great picture, big picture in great detail as well of what exactly is going on. And I would like to turn now to Ambassador Jarbusinova, Madina Jarbusinova, who she is a member of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women under the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Welcome to our panel, Ambassador Jarbusinova. We are looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for our invitation. I'd like to say good morning. It's morning in your part of the world, and it's evening in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia. But I'm glad to participate at this panel and discuss the issues of global importance, because I do agree with previous speakers that violence against women, discrimination of women is a global problem. It's not only the problem in Kazakhstan or in Central Asia. Violence against women impacts women across the world, regardless of age, race, class, and ethnicity. And according to the UN estimations, 30% of women, actually each third women aged 15 years or older, globally have experienced violence, physical, sexual, or emotional violence from intimate partner during the lifetime. I was introduced as the member of the UN committee, UN CEDAW Committee on the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination against women. Actually, I'm elected member, and my term will start on January 1st next year, because just a couple of weeks the elections took place, and I am the first woman, not only from Kazakhstan, but from Central Asia, who in our 32 years membership to UN was given this chance to be elected to this committee. It's, to my opinion, on one hand, it's recognition of the commitments of our governments to improve the situation, to empower women, and on the other hand, it's also a balanced approach by UN members to and their recognition of the need to have representatives from different parts of the world to sit in the committee in order to bring the knowledge and expertise from our region, and to take the same knowledge and good practice back to the region. And I do agree with the data which were given by Dr. Jennifer Winston regarding the Central Asia, as far as the underrepresentation of women, economic problems, because I'm not going to repeat this, but I'd like to underline that violence against women stems from gender inequality and discrimination, and it's a manifestation of, to some extent, historically unequal power relations between men and women, which have led to domination over and discrimination against women by men, and to the prevention of the full advancement of women. And speaking about women in Kazakhstan, women are important part of Kazakhstan economic life, and but on the other hand, experts say that there is a pronounced gender wage gap, unadjusted for gender difference in human capital. The gender wage gap in Kazakhstan is about 32%. As I have said, women in Kazakhstan, as well as in Central Asia, and Dr. Winston spoke about this, are underrepresented in the political sphere. And you mentioned that women elected as deputies in the amount make 27% in Kazakhstan. No, we have a decrease in this figure. It was about we had this 28% before the last elections, and now the decrease is to 17%. So it's even lower the number of deputies in the parliament, the lower chamber of the parliament of Kazakhstan. And the number of women ministers is not also high. Speaking about women in diplomacy, there are only 4 women ambassadors of nearly 70 heads of embassies of Kazakhstan worldwide. So this is a sort of experts say, or often it is said that this underrepresentation in the in politics is due to the lack of financial resources needed to engage in pre-election campaigning, negative stereotypes against women in leadership positions. I would like to underline these negative stereotypes against women in leadership positions, and of course domestic problems. Women hold a considerable presence in the civil service, but are underrepresented at the higher level. They do, however, predominate in such spheres as judiciary, in social services, in education, but this predominance doesn't mean that they occupy high positions even in this sphere. We should also speak about some culture, traditions, and beliefs, stereotypical beliefs that influence greatly the construction of gender identities and social norms in Kazakhstan as well as in Central Asia as whole. Gender roles and ideologies are also different in certain regions of Kazakhstan. For example, in southern Kazakhstan, where we have a high number of educated women, often they do not actively seek employment outside the home due to some stereotypical traditions and a division of responsibilities in the families. Violence against women, to my mind, is primarily a cause and consequence of gender inequalities. And you're right that even the improved legislation, a well-established law, cannot just change the situation. There should be active engagement, not only women, but men in these movements and campaigns, as well as this movement which went beyond the borders of Kazakhstan after the murder of Saltanat the movement which got the name for Saltanat. And so you even name this law as Saltanat's law, although in Kazakhstan maybe it's not called the Saltanat's law, but I do agree that, and it's recognized in our society that this high-profile murder accelerated the changes, the acceptance of the changes to the law, and 2 days ago this law came into force, and criminalization of domestic violence is a sort of a victory of the civil society, of the public movement in Kazakhstan, and the work of the parliamentarians in these different councils with civil society and gender activists. And I want even already when the trial was coming to an end, it was I think followed by nearly all elderly Kazakhstani citizens. When the trial was coming to an end, some new cases became known. So I think that this is also a result or impact of this trial, as women stopped being ashamed of recognizing that they were harassed, that their rights were violated, and they spoke about the need of their rights to be respected and recognized. And some new cases are now in the court. Well, just 2 days ago, Akim, and you know, this is the head of the administration offices, Akim of one of the regions in Atyrau Oblast was sentenced as a result of his wife's application to the court, and she was speaking about her being harassed and beaten during the 11 years of her family life. Also, a high-ranking official, administrative official in one of our oblasts. So, speaking about the work with the United Nations on in this area, I'd like to say that there is a political will. The law wouldn't have been adopted if there were not President's open calls and his open admittance of this violence and discrimination as a problem in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan participates in United Nations, not only this 2030 UN agenda with the goals, but also we have commitments. The state, we have commitments in the framework of a Generation Equality Forum. This is a follow-up to Beijing conference, maybe even an attempt by the UN to accelerate the implementation of Beijing commitments. And the first action coalition to which Kazakhstan joined, it was announced by our president during Paris Generation Equality Forum in 2021. The first coalition was on gender-based violence. And so I think that these legislative reforms and changes are a way of our implementation of the commitments, although speeded up by the high-profile murder cases in Kazakhstan. And another action coalition to which we joined and work quite efficiently with UN agencies is the economic justice and human rights, because economy is the area where women are not fully equal, and the discrimination happens. You mentioned the Istanbul Convention, and I'd like to mention that we're discussing the way of joining the Istanbul Convention. And on the way to the Istanbul Convention, we are planning to join the ILO Convention 190. This is to prevent sexual harassment at working place. So,
Thank you. Yeah. I'm sorry, I thought I interrupted you, Ambassador.
no.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. You are absolutely right. Despite the fact that more girls than boys enroll in colleges in Kazakhstan and more women attain master's and doctoral degrees, women are still earning an average of 67% of what men are earning. And this is in Kazakhstan, but this is also in this country to a large extent, although the gap might be a little smaller. But this morning on the radio, women surgeons, medical surgeons were saying that on average they earn at least 8% less than men in the same position. So I would like to turn now to Dr. Ariel Cohen, who is the managing director of the Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center here in Washington. Ariel is a renowned specialist on Russia and Eurasia. He has a PhD from Tufts Fletcher School of Law, but he's also in diplomacy, but he's also a lawyer by education. So he is going to talk about the problem with domestic violence and gender equality from the perspective of a lawyer. Thank you. Thank you, Ariel.
Thank you. This is working, I presume, right? Yeah, thank you. In addition to law and lifelong interest in Russia and Eurasia, I worked for 8 years as a public opinion researcher. And I think this issue that is symbolized by what we call Saltanat's law, but it's not just about Saltanat's law. It is about essentially the soul of Kazakhstan and about modernization. Traditional societies, be it Islamic, Christian, Orthodox Jewish, or others, have a very hierarchical structure in which women are relegated to a secondary position. Modernistic societies have equality of gender and equality of rights. Just before I came online now, I looked up one of the regional neighbors of Kazakhstan, Iran. I did a lot of looking at Russia, but Iran is an extreme case because in the civil act or civil law of Iran that regulates relationships in the family, women are defined as the property of the husband, not in Sharia, not in religious law, in civil law. And the terms are property and maintenance. So the husband has a right, the husband is explicitly the head of the family. I wouldn't mind if the law, no, I'm just kidding. The husband is a head of the family, and he has a duty to maintain the wife, like you maintain property. But if the wife does not perform her duties, as the very interesting conversation that Jennifer quoted between a mother and their two daughters, and the daughter says, "You're the wife." She said, "No, I'm doing all the hard work. I'm the husband." So if the wife doesn't perform the duties, the husband is exempt of the maintenance duty under the law. And that is an extreme case, of course. Now, let's move on to Russia. Russia decriminalized violence in the family, not just against women, also against children. So if a parent beats up a child or psychologically and systematically abuses a child, there's a fine if it's proven in court. And then oftentimes the NGOs that are dealing with this issue in Russia would report that a fine triggers more violence. So if a woman complains of abuse, police gets involved, writes a fine to the husband, or he goes to some low-level administrative court. The court fines the husband. That escalates the violence. I also found a lot of reporting or commentary, including from lawyers in Russia, criticizing what they call the Western approaches to family law and juvenile justice. They say, well, you know, it was pioneered in America, this horrible, as the Russians call it, Anglo-Saxon country. Then it was copied in France. But look, you know, they're taking kids away from, you know, abusive families and abusive circumstances. This is not the way to do it. This is against Russian skripy, Russian traditional ties of the families. This is not our way. And as early as 2012, there are demonstrations with thousands of people, 2,000 people came out for a demonstration against juvenile justice in Moscow, probably urged by the Russian Orthodox Church. And the church is also was a significant factor in decriminalizing violence against women. So what happened? As Kazakhstan for decades and centuries was paying a lot of attention to what's going on with the big northern neighbor, in 2017, they also decriminalized the violence against women. And the statistics that I looked at demonstrated decline of reported violence. Well, if it's not a crime, you know, why bother and report it, right? Less work for the police, less work for the courts. However, I found different reports of how many women die of family violence in Kazakhstan. The lowest figure is about 80 a year. That's 80 too many. And higher numbers that I saw is 400 a year. Now, in the US, to compare, Kazakhstan is 16 and a half times smaller than the US, 20 million versus 330 million. So I did the calculations, and probably we in the US have better reporting numbers. And also the category is family deaths from family violence, women and children. In the US, in Kazakhstan, if you take the 80,000 number, little calculations here, 80 a year, in the US times 16 and a half, it would be translated 1,300 and something. If you take a higher number, 400, it would be translated 4,000, no, probably more than that, in low thousands. The reported US number that I found is 48,000 women and children killed in the families a year. This is comparable with traffic accidents, so this comparable with fentanyl abuse and drug abuse, medical malpractice, which is 45,000. So this is a huge factor in the US, and we're much more urbanized, much less traditional society, atomized society than a country like Kazakhstan. There are other aspects that you could argue that this is violence. I'm not an authority or an expert on family practices in that part of the world, but what I found in literature are reports on bride kidnapping in Kyrgyzstan in particular, but you hear these stories in other places, Southern Caucasus included. So this notion of a woman as chattel, as property, is a toxic notion. And recognizing the urbanization, recognizing modernization, trying to move Kazakhstan towards OECD membership and norms. President Tokayev in 2022 returned the Constitutional Court, and in 2023 was acutely aware that the society is not happy with violence against women. And I think that the case of the horrible end of Saltanat was a trigger, was a catalyst to move towards a change in legislation, criminalization of family violence, and towards recriminalizing it. And also from the public opinion point of view, now putting my public opinion researcher hat, the demand in the society for a change in this younger, more urbanized, less observant society, that demand made total political sense internally and externally. So internally, younger demographics would be more supportive, men and women, more urban people, more educated people, more in the elite, despite the fact that Saltanat and her abusive husband were a part of the elite. The elites understand, they travel, they read, they get educated abroad. They understand that to abuse women and children, to kill a wife is a taboo now in a modern westernized society. This is not done. This should not be tolerated. We are, I think, in a transitional period. In that law, the activist groups, women's groups, human rights groups pointed out that it didn't put family violence in a separate criminal category. Why is it important? It's important because a situation of abuse in a family is different than, let's say, you were on a soccer team and your teammate punched you out in the face. You can go away. If you complain, there are no day-to-day consequences. Whereas in the family, if you complain, you are trapped in a way in a toxic situation. So the question mark is there going to be a recognition, like we have in the West, of family violence as a separate category? What is the meaning of this clear signal that Kazakhstan, together with other members of what was known as a sort of pro-Western group in the former Soviet Union, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, and now Kazakhstan, criminalize family violence, whereas more pro-Russian country like Belarus decriminalized it, as did Russia. This is the part where we're talking about how to perceive it in sort of foreign and international context as opposed to domestic context, as I mentioned. Another example, if domestic violence is not criminalized, women, who are the vast majority of abuse victims, sometimes it's men too, but mostly women, when they go to receive medical care, I have a report here, the author said, a woman comes to a clinic and says, oh, I slipped and fell, and the doctor goes, and treats the injury as if it was a non-violent trauma. Detour the police. Oh, it's not criminalized. It's not our business. So I found it fascinating that the Russian influence played a role in original decriminalization in 2017. Now, both politically and and internationally it's recognized. The fact is, we are having this discussion in Washington about an internal Kazakh issue. I think it's a strong signal for women and girls inside Kazakhstan that their rights are recognized. The government, what was the expression there? The government that hears. Remember
Yes,
when
yes.
President Tokayev came, the listening government?
Listening government.
Yes, in a good sense, listening government. So the government hears and sees these women and these issues. I think that there are reports that among younger people, Islamic observance does not necessarily clash with the value of women's rights, whereas in more traditional, more orthodox, more strict Islamic tradition, some level of violence towards women and general restriction on women's rights. For example, in Saudi, until very recently, women could not travel without a male companion, and this is still the case in Iran. So, of course, nothing like that happens in Kazakhstan, which is not only a secular country, but also a country with a nomadic tradition. What does it mean? It means that women were left in the settlement, in the yurt, in the family, alone with the children, with cattle, when men were traveling with cattle for pastures and whatnot. So it's a different tradition, different behavioral pattern than in societies that come from a settled and urban culture, for example, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan that we mentioned, etc. So my guess is going to be that this legislative and legal tendency of recognizing both women's rights and fighting against abuse in the families will continue. Finally, I would say that based on what I learned, it is not only a political or solely a legal issue, it's an all society effort. It is the leadership of President Tokayev, it's the education and practice of the courts, and it's the civil society. It's NGOs, it's a media, it's like grassroots effort to recognize this issue and get rid of it on the societal level, which would be a great step forward for Kazakhstan in terms of its modernization, urbanization, and general success as a society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ariel. It is indeed a momentum, not only in Kazakhstan, it's a momentum throughout Central Asia. And it reflected on Russia. Actually, that there was a pretty significant impact on Russian women, Russian society in that respect. And that momentum should be used. For example, there was a case in Almaty last year, a young woman, a lawyer, was killed by her partner. And he got very, very lenient sentence initially, only a year and a half in prison. After the case of Saltanat, the case was reviewed in Almaty, and the person who committed the murder went to prison for 11 years. So there is a change in behavior in society, and there is change in behavior in courts. And I think that one of the most important segments of this law is giving the police ability to investigate crimes of domestic violence, even if they're not reported by the victim, even if they're reported in the media or they're reported in the social media, they still have the obligation to investigate and take measures. And this is what the essence of the action plan that was announced in December of last year, which is action plan not only on human rights, but also on rule of law. the change of the judicial system, the change of the police, how they address those issues is going to be incredibly important. But since we're talking about how women find their place in society, I would like to turn to Dina Danyarova here. She is a coordinator of the Academy for Women Entrepreneurs in Kazakhstan, but she is also a very successful businesswoman, and she's going to share with us her views on what are the options, what are the possibilities before women, and what are the obstacles to their professional development and to their societal acceptance as equal members of society. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you, Margarita, for this kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the organizer for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to join all of you today. So as Margarita mentioned, in one of my projects, I work as coordinator for the Academy for Women Entrepreneurs. So let me just quickly shed a light on this program. The Academy for Women Entrepreneurs program, or shortly O, it's a U.S. Department of State program, but has been launched by Educational and Cultural Affairs Department in 2019. And now it works around in more than 100 countries, including Kazakhstan. And so in Kazakhstan, it has been launched in 2020. And so in 2021, I had the pleasure of working on expanding it. And for the first time, it has been conducted in Kazakh language. So I think it's important when the international programs enter the country, they also take the language component and they target the right regions and the audience to achieve the right impact and the results. And we have seen through the program the changes that a lot of the women, we had the class of over 100 women go through this educational program. And after that, we took the measurement of how it has impacted their views in all the spheres. They have gone also for the GBV training in conjunction with the international partners. And so we see that their perception, their understanding certainly changes. They see that the opportunities that the world presents are just really great and just limitless almost for most of them. So we see that educational programs have the power to create the new cohort of ambassadors for gender equality, not just in our country, but also in the region. And in the example of this program, for instance, it's also implemented in other countries of Central Asia, and we see the potential for the exchange between women entrepreneurs. The women's economic empowerment agenda is high on the priority for the governments, and in Kazakhstan, over 43% of small and medium enterprises are led and founded by women. But the issue is that we see that there is, for instance, 3/4 of micro businesses are run by women, but as you go up to large businesses, the number is very, very small. So we see that there is a limit in what the size of the businesses that they run. So it might be there's not enough probably research at this point yet to explain all the reasons. I think there are many, and a lot of them have been explained and mentioned also by the previous speakers, I think. So we see the potential in women growing their businesses for them to reach new levels. So for instance, if this 3/4 of women from micro businesses, they move to small and medium enterprises, and the same for the SMEs, they move to the larger businesses, we see that the impact will be tremendous, not just for the economy, but I think for their understanding, and they can in turn lead it to help to other parts of the gender equality agenda. Another project that we've worked on in Kazakhstan is, for instance, the World Economic Forum's Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator. It has been mentioned, for instance, by Ambassador Jerbusinova. There are still gender gaps in many areas of economy, including the pay gap, and the pay gap that has been also mentioned by Dr. Wistrand. So yes, it definitely has been highlighted. But what I'd like to add to that is that there are two components to why it exists. One of the components, as we looked at the analysis, is because women are predominantly working in the social sphere, for instance, educational sphere, which has lower salaries. So that's a big driver. And the higher salaries that are present in, for instance, oil and gas, energy, mining sectors, women have less representation. So as women increase participation in STEM sectors, we hope to see that this wage pay gap to close, and let's say naturally, at least in part. Another component, and I think on the opportunity side that Margarita mentioned also, is political participation. So to build up on what Ambassador Gerbsinova mentioned, yes, we had the decrease in the number of women in the parliament, but in part, this is the consequences of the political system maturing. We had the change in how the last election has been conducted. So for instance, if before it was fully by the party list, in which case the 30% quota for the list would have had, let's say, a stronger effect. Now we have 30% that are being elected directly, in which case the quota cannot essentially help. But it means there's definitely a lot more work probably to do in ensuring more women participate, and so that they elected actually, they're actually participating and more are being elected in offices. And I think Dr. Cohen also mentioned one of the great points on the public opinion. And while I think all the speakers mentioned that Saltanat's law has accelerated and helped tackling in part, I think, the biases that the population had or the women had, and the shame that they probably experienced not sharing before. It certainly have had an increase in the cases, but also the coverage of those cases. Now, regardless of whether it's a high political figure or it's, say, somebody who is less known, we still see a lot of the articles, a lot of the media attention, comments. So I think it means that the society itself sees this is an important agenda, and which is why the law, I think, had this momentum as well, and hopefully will continue the development. So for instance, just yesterday, we also had one of the cases which was broadly mentioned in the media, commented, and what I personally noticed a lot more is that the comments, they're changing. So if you look at the comments that were, or the public opinion that seemed to be floating around at the beginning of the Saltanat's case, there were more people who were skeptical or just writing explicitly very biased comments. There is now a lot more critical thinking going into the comments, more understanding into the complexity of this issue. But I think the media itself also needs probably understand the responsibility of correct way of handling and approaching the victims as well. So I think there is a lot of room for development in that area. And finally, in the economic sphere, I think the important growth potential will come from the private sector companies. So in the academy, we had not just the governments as sponsors, but rather private sector companies. For instance, in the case of oil, it was Coca-Cola and Chevron, both who are present in Kazakhstan, who were some of the sponsors of the program. And we see, for instance, Coca-Cola also focusing on the rural women. So each year they do the programs for women of the rural areas. And so while those programs cannot reach every single woman, I do think here, just even hearing, seeing some of the winners of educational programs helps change the mentality, understand that they can and should seize these opportunities. And so I think the next stage of the momentum will come from the economic participation. And as Kazakhstan has entered top 30 countries by economic participation in the WEF ranking, we still see that there is further room for growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dina. This is really a very important program. Just the awareness of women of their rights and their opportunities and the solidarity between women, among women, to change the system is something that is really going to change eventually this societal bias. And our last speaker today is Joy Neumayer, who is a journalist and historian of Russia and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. And she has an upcoming book called Survivor's Education, Women, Violence, and and the stories we don't tell. Thank you, Joy, for coming on screen today to talk to us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I've really enjoyed listening to and learning from all of the speakers. I wrote an essay about this case for Foreign Policy, and I'm going to talk a bit about the trial and the law, and especially the regional response to them from my perspective as a journalist. So, of course, we know that the Bishimbayev trial took place over the course of several weeks. Bishimbayev had been a favorite of Kazakhstan's former president, Nazarbayev. He had many advantages that were supposed to help him join this promising new generation of officials, including a scholarship to study at George Washington University in the US. In the end, he only served a few months as economy minister before being sentenced to 10 years in prison on corruption charges, though he was pardoned by Nazarbayev after only 18 months. After his release from prison is when he met Saltanat Nukanova, the astrologer who he ended up marrying at an exclusive restaurant in Astana that is owned by Bishimbayev's family. And less than a year later, this same restaurant became the site of Nukanova's murder. It's hard to overstate what a huge deal the trial was. Clearly, this is already evident from our panel, but millions of Russian speakers tuned in for the daily live stream, which in turn fueled the intense daily media coverage that the case received in Kazakhstan, as well as in Russia and many other countries. I would say that it was similar to the fascination surrounding the O.J. Simpson trial in the US, only multiplied by a factor of 10. Really huge interest and attention. And the case in the trial led to public demonstrations against domestic violence, led by the Kazakh diaspora in a number of countries, including the Czech Republic, Germany, and Poland, as well as a big outpouring of solidarity with Saltanat Nukanova and grief over her death on social media. A lot of these posts were by young women in particular who were taking a stand against gender-based violence. When the trial began in late March, Bishimbayev initially pleaded not guilty. He said that she fell and hit her head while drunk, and his defense team was obviously trying to play on conservative social sentiments among jurors, trying to depict her as jealous and provocative, and sort of suggesting that she had it coming. Jurors heard a very different story from her family and friends, who testified that they had seen her in the months leading up to her death with lots of bruises and marks from choking. And of course, as already has been mentioned, the cause of death was verified by a medical examiner, that it was from blunt force trauma to the head, as well as the effects of strangulation. Over the course of the daily live stream, some of the contents of this trial were really quite sensational and shocking. It included security camera footage, which Bishimbayev had asked a male relative to delete, but was in fact recovered, that showed him hitting and kicking and dragging Saltanat Nukanova by the hair in the hallway of the restaurant. And Bishimbayev's initial not guilty plea started to change over the course of the trial, especially after over a dozen videos were retrieved from his phone, which showed him torturing his wife. These were not shown to the public, but members of her family viewed them in the courtroom and were extremely overcome. One of them had to leave because they felt sick. So initially, after saying these videos were fake, Bishimbayev ultimately admitted to filming them and to causing his wife's death, although he continued to claim that it was unintentional. And in May, the jury did find him guilty and sentenced him to 24 years in prison. As we've discussed, in the years leading up to this, Kazakhstan had followed the Russian approach to gender-based violence. It had followed Russia's partial decriminalization in 2017. And this copycat legislation has been encouraged by the Kazakh Union of Parents, which is a conservative organization that basically parrots official Russian rhetoric and promotes conservative social policy and was opposed to recriminalizing domestic abuse. feminist activists had tried for several years to change the decriminalization to no avail. But of course, after this high-profile murder, a petition calling for recriminalization received over 150,000 signatures and helped bring about what we were referring to as Saltanat's law. It's certainly not perfect, as Dr. Cohen noted. Some feminists are not pleased about the fact that it's not a separate domestic violence law. People have also noted that it lacks provisions against stalking or the sexual harassment of adults. Nevertheless, the trial and Saltanat's law were a huge deal, not only in Kazakhstan, but especially in Russia, where the case received a ton of press attention for reasons that I think are pretty interesting. So President Vladimir Putin has made conservative gender politics central to his regime and its global image and influence. But after the passage of Saltanat's law, and over the course of the trial, some regional media outlets in Russia used coverage of the case as an opportunity to lament the status quo of spiraling domestic violence in Russia in a way that challenged the Kremlin's stance on so-called traditional values. For example, there was a segment about the trial by a local TV news outlet in the Russian city of Krasnoyarsk, which noted that domestic violence is rising in Russia and usually goes unpunished. And the reporter spoke to locals who were following events in Kazakhstan and wanted similar changes to the law in Russia. There was also a lot of social media commentary about the case. Several influential Russian vloggers flew to Astana to attend the trial, if only briefly. And Ksenia Sobchak was probably the most famous of them, this kind of celebrity influencer journalist. Her YouTube video about the case got almost 10 million views. Wow. And these and other YouTube documentaries about the trial, the comment sections were just flooded with descriptions of basically women describing abuse that they had experienced and offering support to other women. The Ombudsman for Human Rights in the Russian region of Yakutia called for a law similar to Saltanat's law. And even though the recriminalization of domestic violence, polls have shown, enjoys wide public support in Russia, officials close to the Kremlin have rejected these calls. Someone named Nina Ostanina, who's the chair of the Russian Duma's Committee on Women, Families, and Children, said that women in Russia can prevent domestic violence by marrying for love rather than chasing after a sugar daddy. Of course, in the context of the war in Ukraine, officials have a compelling reason not to punish domestic violence because intimate abuse normalizes brutality on the front in Ukraine and vice versa. And I found it really interesting. This played out in a direct way in the Bishimbayev trial. A Russian medical examiner employed by Bishimbayev's defense team suggested, without examining her body, that Saltanat Nukanova had died of natural causes. Now, the same medical examiner had also appeared on Russian television, claiming that photos of corpses in the Ukrainian city of Bucha had been staged. And of course, this is a well-known civilian massacre. So domestic and sexual violence, both at home and abroad, are very closely intertwined in Russia. And while the Russian state is trying to turn attention away from this problem, officially, this is the Year of the Family, which is a big pronatalist campaign that Putin announced. Many people are afraid of returning soldiers and the well-publicized incidents of crimes committed by them, including domestic violence-related murders. So in Kazakhstan, I think that, as we've talked about, this departure from the Russian legal template for handling or enabling, is a better way to put it, domestic abuse, is indicative of Russia's waning influence in Central Asia, which has been, activists who I spoke with in Kazakhstan told me that Russia's reputation has been severely damaged in Kazakhstan by the war in Ukraine, which most people blame Russia for. And it's led to increased regional cooperation on many issues, including women's rights. And it's worth noting that Saltanat's law was preceded by a 2023 law in Uzbekistan, which also served as a local precedent for it. So, of course, women's rights have a long way to go, as they do everywhere. Particularly notable, I think, is the Kazakh government's continued hostility towards the queer community. Only a few weeks before he signed this law, Tokayev approved a bill that bans queer people from adopting children or serving as their guardians, which, can be seen as loosely inspired by laws in Russia. Nevertheless, I think we all agree that to some extent this trial is rightfully seen as a watershed moment. It marks a rare case when a member of the ruling elite has been held responsible for gender-based violence, and it offers some hope of accountability, which so often seems impossible, not only in Central Asia, but in other countries as well, including Russia and often the United States, which I talk about in my book that's coming out soon. So just to conclude, though this trial was preceded by a lot of persistent grassroots activism surrounding cases that received much less attention, and this activism will continue after Saltanat's law has gone into effect, it's important to recognize the powerful symbolic valence of this case, which I think will continue, we all think will continue to be a powerful international reference point in the struggle for gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy. Very, very good connection you made with Russia and the impact of what is happening in Kazakhstan to the Russian society. One side connection to this case was that it happened during Vladimir Putin's visit to Astana for the OSCE meeting. Just at the time, a part of his delegation, official delegation, was dining at the same restaurant on the same evening when Saltanat was killed. I found it interesting connection here, although it's not really related to the crime. But I would like to open for questions now. We have people online and we have people in the room. Please feel free to ask your question. Mamie.
Hi, my question is in regards to women in education. So if there's more women getting masters and PhDs in Kazakhstan, I was wondering if there's any correlation between violence against women in education in general, with women either leaving education or maybe choosing to push through and maybe try to make a difference in that realm.
I think absolutely. They're interconnected, but perhaps the ambassador would have more to say on this issue in Kazakhstan in particular.
Actually, I don't see any connection between violence and education of women living education, if I correctly haven't understood the question. In general, women in Kazakhstan show the high level of education. We have even more educated women graduated from higher institutions than men. The percentage is higher. More women with PhD degrees or doctorate degrees according to the old system. But the role of education in prevention of violence, this is another question of, if not, well, it wasn't touched today. We realize and recognize that there is a need to educate both young boys and young girls, to educate them in human rights and to educate boys as far as the recognition of the dignity and human rights of girls and women are concerned. So just this morning, I participated in the meeting of the Astana Commission on Women and Family Gender Issues, and we discussed this issue of protection of girls and women's rights. And according to this Saltanat's law, the government is to budget the establishment of family centers, the main role of which will be to prevent this abuse and violence in families and in the society. And I also, not maybe related to this question, want to say that last year, Kazakhstan initiated the establishment of the Regional Central Asian Alliance on Prevention of Gender-Based Violence. The team of experts visited our Central Asian neighboring states to discuss the structure of this alliance, and in a week in Almaty there'll be a meeting, mainly a discussion, a dialogue, in the form of a dialogue between the state officials from Central Asian states and civil society gender activists to discuss this alliance. And Kazakhstan's government has allocated $300,000 this year for the establishment of this alliance. So this is to speak about the attitude or focus of the Central Asian states on this prevention of gender-based violence, and also prevention of discrimination. And speaking about the criminalization of violence, I'd like also to mention that actually Uzbekistan was the first country in our region where last year criminalization of domestic violence took place in the legislation. So I hope that this example of Kazakhstan, this strong movement in our society against the domestic gender-based violence will be followed. And just yesterday through internet I read that Russian's Commission on Human Rights ombudsperson Moskalkova voiced the possibility of criminalization of domestic violence in Russia. Who knows?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone on the panel, for your time and presentations. I have a question about the nature of the trial itself and the fact that this was such a transformative event that was brought on by the trial. So from an American perspective, there are these trials that live on in the public consciousness. Brown v. Board, I could name 100 others, and it has changed how civil society and state institutions operate in reference to this trial. And I was wondering if the panelists, but especially Dr. Cohen and Ambassador Jarbusinova, could say more about how the fact that this was a trial that sparked so much change has impacted what the change has been, what civil society is doing, and if there's anything else that I'm leaving out, I'd love to hear it. So thank you again very much.
Let me say a couple of things before I pass to Ariel and Ambassador Jarbusinova. This trial was unusual. First of all, it was live streamed. Everybody was able to see at any time the proceedings of the court. Secondly, Saltanat was a very beautiful, vibrant woman, popular and loved by her family and popular among her friends, who posted a lot of videos and pictures of her when she was still alive. And those images put a face, they humanize the victim. Very often, victims in these kind of cases are not humanized, they are anonymous, they remain anonymous, and that prevents the public from understanding the problem. Third, the former official who escaped his first sentence with only 18 months of serving, that caused additional outrage. But the nature of the crime was also the other part that really made it very palpable to society. And now in this era of television cameras, CCTV everywhere, and recordings on videos, and the perpetrator, the murderer, also recorded torturing his wife, this is not possible to be hidden anymore. They are victims and they are witnesses, and the witnesses don't have to be necessarily human. Their cameras, their video recordings, their audio recordings. Things are changing, and the society will have to change as well. But let me pass to Ariel for if he wants to answer this question.
I think that Wesley Hill, who works with me at the International Tax and Investment Center, is absolutely right. This was a high-profile court. And I think Kazakhstan was not accustomed until now to something like that. I think it's also important to highlight the value or the position the judiciary branch now has in Kazakhstan. Because before, the country traditionally, and this goes back to the Soviet and even Russian imperial times, it's the executive that dominated everything. So it was almost like a pyramid of branches. It's not separation of power in sort of Western sense before that. So the role of the court was highlighted by these proceedings. But also, this is Astana. The court was in Astana, not in Almaty, right? This is Astana. This is the beau monde, the high society in a way. If it happened in Pavlodar Oblast, if it happened in Turkestan or Shymkent, it wouldn't be so high profile. So, but it also sends a signal that these types of cases are a priority. They can be adjudicated on merits. The начальство, the higher ups, cannot sweep everything under the rug. And that is very important. And I really hope I'm right, that it is a watershed event, not just in terms of visibility in social media, but in terms of practice of the law and protection of women.
Thank you. Ambassador Jerbusinova, do you want to add something?
Well, I'd like only to agree with what you've said, Margareta, and Dr. Cohen, about the high visibility and high attention in the society to this trial of the high-profile murder, and it was watched by officials and by civil society, and it was well reported in the media. And as I've said during my presentation, we already see the impact of this trial through some changes in the sentences which have already been taken in, maybe not similar, but also in cases of violence and sexual harassment. And this violence against women, we know, is very latent. Women are mostly ashamed of admitting them being beaten, discriminated. But this case to my mind, also help women understand that if they continue keeping silence, then their daughters, their sisters will be beaten and continue beaten, and will be violate their rights will be violated, and the predominance of men will exist in our future. So in several already cases which are discussed in the society of this severe violation of women's wives' right already in public.
Thank you. Alex has a question here.
Thank you so much. Hi, Alejandro Sanchez. I'm an analyst here in Washington, D.C. Question for Dina. A few weeks ago, there was an event at the World Bank here in Washington. It was about U.S.-Kazakhstan economic cooperation. There was a delegation from Kazakhstani entrepreneurs and officials that came to Washington. One of them was Diana Kamaladin, who's the founder of Kamaladin University, and apparently she's in the Forbes 30 under 30 list. I was wondering if you can talk more about how easy or difficult it is for women to start their own businesses in Kazakhstan. Do they need like a male sponsor or something like that? I've heard that happens in some other places. And do you have any information in which you can compare situation in Kazakhstan as compared to some neighboring countries? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So in short, no, we don't have any restrictions in terms of the business registration or any gender discrimination directly in the say for the registration to receive the loan. You don't need such approvals from your husband, father, etc. I say in some of the countries that you mentioned that may be more say conservative in that regard. So women are free to register, take out the loans, to participate fully. I think the restrictions come more so from within. They're not legal restrictions, but rather they come from the fact that women also have more in domestic jobs that they need, more roles that they need to fulfill at home, which then serve itself as a gap or ceiling to the potential that women can reach. I think that's the key restraining factor here.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. Okay.
Thank you. My question was inspired by Dr. Neumeyer's comments on the reaction in Russia, including, of course, Ksenia Sobchak. I was curious if we might expect a more overt or stronger reaction from Putin himself. Of course, any strong reaction from Putin in regards to Kazakhstan sort of troubles Kazakhstan and Russia's current somewhat ambiguous relationships, especially during in context of the war in Ukraine. And I was curious if anyone had any thoughts regarding Putin's potential reaction.
Yeah, in terms of this case, I don't think that he or, Peskov made any comment. It was covered wildly on Russian state media, Channel One and so on, although they did not make any reference to domestic affairs. I think I would describe the public relationship between Russia and Kazakhstan now, as I see it, as a sort of mutual non-aggression pact. Kazakhstan does not recognize the annexed territories in Ukraine. And yet, the leaders of Central Asian countries show up for the Victory Day parade in Moscow, which is a huge sort of propaganda event to promote the war. So, yeah, it's complex, but I'm interested to hear if anyone else has thoughts.
The neighborhood for Kazakhstan and the fact that it's landlocked creates a lot of challenges. So you have Russia to the north with one of the longest borders in the world. You have China which is increasingly becoming the leading investor in Kazakhstan. You have more Islamic countries to the south, while the post-Soviet republics remain secular, at least in theory. For the south, you have Afghanistan with the Taliban, you have Iran that I mentioned before, you have extremist madrasas in Pakistan, and a large political representation of Islamists in the south. So it's a very, very tough neighborhood. And it takes leaders like former President Nazarbayev and current President Tokayev. Tokayev, as you know, was foreign minister twice and prime minister, people with a lot of experience. President Tokayev was also a senior UN official. It takes skills, highest level of diplomacy, to navigate between China, Russia, and at the same time to keep good relations with the West. And in view of that, recriminalization of family violence when Russia goes into demodernization direction by decriminalizing violence in the family, by having a very prominent role for the Orthodox Church that is melding. There's a mind meld between the state and the church in Russia, by being vehemently and loudly anti-gay. I think Kazakhstan is sending a signal here. And as I said in the beginning of my presentation, I think the vector in Kazakhstan still is towards modernization, towards more, not less, integration into the world, and recognizing that this generation, the modern generation of younger, more educated Kazakhs, are not buying this horrible stuff of beating women and children up. And this is actually makes good politics inside Kazakhstan, and Russia will deal with it. I think the threats from Russia are on a different level. They're on the level of militaristic, imperialistic policy in the neighborhood. And I hope Kazakhstan manages to navigate these stormy waters with full sovereignty and territorial integrity going into the future.
Thank you, Ariel. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Ainur. My question is about the law. So what challenges might the government face in effectively implementing and enforcing this legislation, especially considering the prevalence of economic and psychological violence that remain unaddressed?
Okay, who would like to answer this question?
Jennifer?
Jennifer, do you want to speak on that?
It's a great question. And I think there's going to be a lot of challenges. All I can say is going back to maybe some of my remarks, you have to obviously have laws, right? Put in place. That's a first step. And you can have, but as we all know, right? If you look at the Central Asian states, if you look at the South Caucasian states, look at any state, right? You can have excellent laws on paper, but what's in practice, right? And so I think this is a very good step because of the fact, as everyone's mentioned, the high attention it's received. So that's going to make it somewhat easier to enforce it, right, than a law that has had no attention. But when you've got some of the societal and cultural issues that have been mentioned, the ambassador, underscoring, I talked about as well, kind of gender ideologies. If those go unaddressed, if you have still an economic system in many places, it's wonderful for the women who are able to get advanced degrees, or for the women who are able to be entrepreneurial, but that's still in any society, right? Even take the US or other, that's a smaller segment of the population, right? So in terms of how do you change the economic structure for the entire society, that's going to take time. Changing gender ideologies will take time. So I think in this case, what is good is what everyone has mentioned, is that the law has gotten such attention. So that's going to force people to keep circling back to it. But by no means is this going to change circumstances overnight.
Thank you. And we are at the end of our event today. would you like, anyone wants to say a few words at the end? Shall we circle around the participants? Ambassador Jarbusinova, please.
Well, just a few words. I do agree with Jennifer that it's one thing to have a law adopted and signed by the president, and quite another is its implementation in practice. We have many good laws, but in practice, not always followed. But I do hope that as this law was adopted to some extent under direct instruction of the president, his call for the parliamentarians to consider the legislation and to introduce needed changes in order to decrease the violence and discrimination of women and minors in the society. So it will be under the control of the president's administration, its implementation, I mean. So it's good that already certain measures have been announced, not only to criminalize the beating, but also to strengthen the administrative responsibility, some measures addressing the aggressors, psychological rehabilitation, and so on, including education. I'd like to already mention that although the president declared the need to build the new Kazakhstan, to make the state the listening Kazakhstan, so to hear the voice of the citizens, there are already some other voices contradicting to this decriminalization of the law. It was mentioned the union of parents, which actually this union calls for the return of the decriminalization, for the parliament to call this law back, as they, according to the information they spread, and they also initiated the petition, this law is against the family and children. So we have to work with our population. There is a need for politicians, judiciary, journalists to explain the essence of the law and to speak loudly about the fact that during the 6 years when we had this violence decriminalized, there were about 1,300 women murdered by their intimate partners, and not speaking about those who were severely beaten and discriminated. So I hope, I do understand that there should be joint efforts of the judiciary, officials, civil society, parliamentarians, in order for this law not only to come in force, as it happened this late Monday, but also be in the interest of our women and girls.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all participants. Thank you, our speakers today. What an excellent panel. Looking into the issue from all sides, I am very grateful for that. With this, we're closing the event today, and we're looking forward to future discussions on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this webinar.
Thank you.